Should a person still start from top to bottom in the RDL / what I imagine is SDL? Would y'all call that stiff-legged deadlift? Not single-leg deadlift. Okay. Should a person still start from the top to bottom in an RDL or stiff-legged deadlift when they can touch the floor without running their back? Can they just perform the RDL or stiff-legged deadlift from the floor while keeping the knees a little straighter compared to a conventional deadlift? So if you can touch the floor, should you just start from the floor?
I know some people don't like this, but I think there are some important differences between RDLs and stiff leg deadlifts, like the amount of hip flexion that you're getting.
Let's go over that first.
So an RDL, there's going to be more knee flexion. There's going to be more horizontal hip displacement. You're going to have this horizontal movement of the hips. In a stiff leg, and what that's going to accomplish is you're going to be hitting your glutes and your hamstrings, but your hamstrings, because they're shortened at one joint, probably aren't contributing quite as much as they would if your knees were extended. So the idea is that an RDL would be slightly more like glute biased than a true stiff leg deadlift. And for me, an RDL starting from the floor would look very much just like a conventional deadlift from the floor. So I think for like a lot of people, it takes a long time for some people to really learn like proper hinging. And in my experience, it's much easier to teach that when you start from the top and you focus on, driving hips back, rather than starting from the bottom and thinking keep hips back or, you know what I mean? So I think some of it has to do with cueing. But yeah, from like a mobility perspective, like on paper, yeah, it doesn't seem like it would make much of a difference. But I think in execution, you'll probably find the reps are cleaner starting from the top. Yep. I think in both cases. And if you're prohibited by like, okay, I don't have a rack, then, to start with, then do what you got to do. But yeah, and I think for most people, it sounds like you've got a good bit of flexibility, but I think a lot of people, when they, hear the relationship, between range of motion and hypertrophy, they assume like the further down I go, the better. But for a lot of people, once they get kind of just below the knee, that's like as soon as your hips start going or stop going back in an RDL, it's like any further movement of the bar is going to be flexion at the back. So if your hips are still traveling back and you hit the ground, then that's one thing. But if you're below the knee, like for a lot of people, the range of motion is shorter than I think they realize with a proper RDL.
Yeah, just to back you up, the stimulus is higher, not the greater range of motion you get in RDL, but the more you can elongate the glute and the hamstring and also the lower back if you're trying to train it. So there's nothing wrong with getting more range of motion about the lumbar. And there's nothing wrong about it being, more range of motion about the glute. But I wouldn't do those things if it comes at the expense of range of motion at the hamstring. So 7 out of 10 times when someone says, hey, should I go, basically ask a variation on this question, in my experience as a trainer, there's a technical error or there's something that could be optimized in the form of the deadlift if they think they can get that range. Not always, absolutely not. One of those people's on this call, Andrea is not only a woman who on average is more flexible, but also grew up as a gymnast, right? And she has fantastic technique. And you're also short.
The plate from the ground is not as far.
Correct. That 20 kilo plate is a given distance always, and the ground is always where your feet are. So last time I checked, I don't have a reference for that, but
I think so.
I feel like we can go off anecdote for that one. So what normally happens, film yourself from the side and watch your knee. And what will typically happen is as you get towards the end range of the eccentric on an RDL, your knees track forward a little bit. that's basically the thing to fix if you're using an RDL, is your knees should not track forward at all. They can unlock, but they shouldn't track forward at all. And if you can go deeper while keeping your back straight and your hips are not really going further back, you'll hit this end range basically for your hamstring, and then you're getting more range of motion about the hip joint, which means that you're lengthening the glutes and the lumbar, like Brian was saying, which is fine, if you want to do that. So, but often doing that to get more range of motion, which again is not the goal. The goal is longer muscle lengths, not more range of motion, comes at the expense. So what would you like, if I could graph it over time, it would be like all three muscle groups are getting longer. And then as you get longer for your glutes and your lumbar, your hamstrings get shortened right at the end when you don't want that, because the knees are tracking forward. It's taking some tension off them. So that's the thing you want to fix generally. And for most people who are not short female gymnasts, I think the better, if you had to say like, oh, what's a better option, the SLDL or an RDL, I would say the RDL, because you will be able to get to the longest muscle length you can get for all three, the combination thereof doing it. The stiff leg deadlift, you're going to hit your limit of range early on the hamstring, and then not be there for your glutes and lumbar, right? But it's rare. The rare person, like I mentioned earlier, who can doing an RDL will not get to the end range of their hamstring without a technical fault, like I was saying, and hit the ground. And if that is you, load 25-pound plates, So I think it's just it's a more natural movement as well. And in my experience, there's more people when they try to do a true stiff leg deadlift that they get nerve discomfort, like at the back of the
sciatic,
knee.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they are not really hitting as long a muscle lengths as they might actually otherwise if they were in a more comfortable joint position. Then that's kind of anecdotal, but yeah. So I find the RDLs a more natural movement, and yeah. So that's my input.